Okay, good night, everyone. Want to give a warm Five Islands welcome to their colleagues from been here 2.5 years. Young, find myself saying we. Or one family. And I think these represent two ends of my career. So it gives me real pleasure sitting member of faculty, and on the way, always the one grateful that young Devon was, I think, one of my young prophets for the recognized talent I as a man. He's grown up. So it's my pleasure to welcome them. And we really want to thank them. You know, last night I was saying that Five Islands campus has been lucky in more ways than one as a young person. And I think two scholars of take it upon themselves to so colleagues, warm welcome and everybody.
Just if I may more formally, Professor, it's really our pleasure, to express our gratitude, to you, who have been most gracious in, I think, facilitating us, share with the young because of the service, this today specifically of, and, you know, I think it's important to it's a Robinson here because not only I and very invited for us, we may have the online audience. I need to share with you of that when this project came into the back creation of discussions for the time within other faculties. I remember and asking you whether or not my participation because it will take some time for me to do so. And you, in fact, right to the lead, the lead of the project, indicating that yes, I will get whatever I get on the thinking project. It was given that obviously me, I may have the part of the project that if you're going to work on the project, that quite naturally you don't quite ask whether or not to post to be able to share this project. So we just want to thank you for graciously accepting share the results. Now I the formal presentation. I just want to say a little bit about the profession when I was the presentation tonight, which is titled Reimagining the Nation, opinion and report in Antigua and Barbuda represents in fact a very, yet I think a very significant part of our other project is the visible from something to I'm representing the other one that was important for sharing of the often when we do that kind of experience, don't have to be back. but we thought it was really important that we do so. Indicated, we are doing Antigua first, and in January, the intention was to share the results of the summit solution. Now, in terms of the project, was the 14 countries. But the practical, of course, that requires to sort of narrow why it is that we actually did for as a first one. The choice of Antigua, as I indicated, is very clear. I also need to share with the platform. When we started, it was in 2021. And therefore, it was sort of our biggest important because Barbuda is going to transit public. I want to capture the views of Barbuda at the time and be able to do so. Now, in terms of the way we're going to organize the presentation with folks, of course, we present different views, different views today. Before we actually get into the nitty-gritty, I guess what you are here to hear, we felt that it was photos will actually help in for they take us back to 1952, of course, as you all know, English speaking Caribbean it was a time before the envisaged the possibilities of independence. Beyond merely maybe anticipating at some point, it was very clear in 1952 that none of the English felt that they would transit to independence as republic. So, in terms of the one, but in the person primary, our relationship, even the level of Elizabeth, we have now translated to India. So in countries that they are later, the questions will not very sort of gauge what people's reaction to honor reaction say, but chance. And when we interested in the difference in opinion of was from the beginning, it's not a warm reception. So, or the images that we are sharing with you, just capture moments that to us reveal very long relationship. Now, we have to go for 92. Reveals the long relationship. It reveals a very complex relationship, and of course, and what you see when you look at the image is that they show us, or they reveal deeply and the history between extra. We have some have representation, we have of course figures of the ways across the region have related to the modern food. I also want to emphasize that this presentation is very this presentation is not specifically the Tigray not giving any position. Very sharing everything. Our aim here is not to have or against any particular group. We're not here to do it. Yeah. Instead, understanding the connection, imagery, through the snapshot and the experiences that have shaped people from the region and engaged in the as you together, exciting about how these relationships have actually evolved. Remember those relationships and how those relationships continue to shape your situations today. And in terms of, I would say, so we have this long enjoyed relationship because this was perhaps one of the tastiest moments in time. I think it's not a very warm, maybe not the big that happens. And during that we brought 2000 visits. I'm indicated that the had maybe a referendum to better transition constitution for reform. Now that should have been and obviously a million. Similarly, in terms of the visit of people and context, we had a similar reaction in Central and everywhere had that. That kind of strong stance against the now, in terms, I think this was important to show. This is something I don't think I saw it in Central. I'm not sure I saw that in Barbuda side. And it does suggest that people appreciate there is a kind of warm initiative made. And of course, so before we can start with sharing the actual results, I think it's important for us to literally say something. The project and the basis are is a major interdisciplinary one. It is funded, not funded by the University of but there was some I resisted observing what's happening about the region of we are here because the principle can be constant people sharing for food. It is funded and it's not a big problem. Bigger than a small one person, number of team of researchers. It's primarily related and different. I invite you next participate in a Zoom panel discussion we won't have. Some of the researchers who are here and which will be very by one of the members of the team. Now, in terms of the discussions within the team, the lead on the team is in fact professional advisor. Communicating is very interesting. We found myself. I said a little while ago about the difficult problem. The project but I did in 1992. And the city was doing that kind of what the is issues surrounding that 92. And it comes from the present moment. So we also now the development difficulties of the one so the example is already and not only are we not in Caribbean, and I should say that support is in charge of the company where is interviewed but also trying to cover governors in the region was to tease out some of the critical issues. But the important looking at the problem as an institution as and the attempts to trace the decolonization that's taking place in Israel. The attempt to examine independence and present day forms that explain the nature of the relationship between the monarch or British and of course the Caribbean. And we see the enduring nature of that relationship, not only of trade ties, not only in terms of application, but what means the most that or notwithstanding some of us have been independent about 60 years and more than 60 years, still continue to operate as constitutional monarchies, having the monarch as the head of state. So the project is therefore attempting through this various designations, attempting to see questions about that relationship. The former policy, also examine the relationship between Britain and some of its overseas territories. Because when you look at today, we have two British overseas dependencies that are part of the analysis that we have said. Now, I need to say something about not well, maybe, and that is because in terms of the former it was not in is the vital of we could not have done so I mean and on the task because I'm not a methodologist, so I really want to try to pay for taking on that. So I just want to share with you. But I just want to share with you the view of where we are at the moment. So we want to link two states. The reality is that in a while ago, we have gained independence from Trinidad and some still have some British and the question what is going on? We really truly when we continue to manifest many things in British, when we continue to have our constitutions which are basically so I want to share with you, for example, I know that what is had to say of the arrangements that one question is independence with an end to at least one that particular activity. Exit, and so Egyptian style movies in the hospitable solution climate change. But you that independence, again, practically, obviously because of, at least represented, region. But is that you really can't did not bring into it any kind of performance. And that is what it's all about. It's about organizing, political organization, movement independence as a partner. Our objective today is for me on the table. And when we look at Antigua and Barbuda, we know that Antigua and Barbuda. We say that, but the reality is that we don't know. And in fact, the results of this study have been a constitutional monarchy. People do not what is a constitution. Make judgments about that constitution. The constitutional context in which the Barbuda is still a constitution. And probably with the constitution and we'll see why towards the end of the constitution, why it might remain. Today, what we have is a not a very popular person for a variety of reasons. Because they are, I think there are essentially 6 that will result to us. That we need to assess the perceived into Antigua and Barbuda. And the reason why is that the survey was being done in Antigua. So although that was the section of so I was very to talk about contrast because it is the head of state. Wanted to place in public use of the royal family, then not all, but we didn't ask specifically. Obviously, we asked about we asked questions about people's perception of
Yes, okay.
but we asked questions about that. We asked about
Anything for me?
Because of his detailed powers. And there is a why you need power. And we ask people very
Back.
because we ask them to make a judgment as people that they recognize our constitution. So first we get a sense of where we are in relation to that. Where we form the activity is out, whether or not are not the citizens and judgments about political systems or even understanding. And as we go through the presentation, the findings, one of the things that sort of not person, but some there is the results that we've obtained in really do some we try to see some wow what that kind of research. But further research needs to be done because we can't answer certain questions as we'll see as we go through this time. We want to measure whether or not there was support. Still some support for them. A Republican commander. What only questions support for a Republican, yet they don't understand it. Based on what they're saying, they could be consistent. And that's the policy recommendation. And we can't be serious about constitution. To understand the world. That's what we don't change the constitution. I'm very mindful certainly will change certain.
Kalia, I need you to try again to make an appointment with the IRS for that lady, for that matter out of Antigua. All right.
But I'm trying to. There's a lot of understanding. Yeah, we have not done sufficient work in educating our people about our systems and about how things work. Make an informed decision. We wanted to therefore explore in all of that. We want to try to understand
Hello?
as to whether or not.
What happened to you? I thought maybe I pick you up on something.
And so this was, we asked.
So when you do your shit in the bathroom,
What do we think?
first time I call you in the bathroom, the second time you're doing some shit.
Right.
Do your shit.
We
you know, there's some fellas that they can only shit in the bushes. You know? All right, look, I don't know where you're getting your information from, right?
I don't know.
About who's saying about 40%. Based on the statement you said, they're paying you for the full ride in the car.
Use of the preferences.
Yeah, but what I pulled up is they value the car at 4,000 and something.
In all of that, really, that
Okay. All right. No, but what I looked at is what I was looking at, I thought was what you said. But I will look at it again. And I will deal with it. I'm back in New York.
There is
I will deal with it tomorrow.
an interest constitutionalism. It has to be founded on.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I will look for the email, but I'm not worried about the position. But what I think we're going to do very early next week, maybe Monday or Tuesday, is to file a lawsuit. Okay. I need you to come with a no fault insurance application, because also all of the therapy, etc., you're getting, you need to have the no fault in place.
So Professor Bartels did an excellent job in backgrounding this research. And my role here is to create several pictures. Technology that we
Orthopedic.
in more materially, I will be going through each stage of the results of the research survey on these objectives.
Which one of them on?
Radio
Show the one.
is that you want to be very is that any sample that you draw from a population is more or less represented.
You need, as far, let me tell you something. My concern is that you get better. You understand? So whatever they say you need to do.
I don't want to get too much. 500 margin of perhaps 4.5%. What that really means is I told you that
show that that is giving the most trouble.
the poor public status of the country. It really means that that particular sample is free. And between 5%, so plus or minus margin of error. So every time our results, see our results within that plus or minus.
Did you explain that to the doctor?
Now, we hired 5 years, and all of the lines under. Now, this happened during the period of November and early December.
Right.
This is all happened last year. As Professor Barger, that we this is working. One, And we had 40 countries to do. So here, Antigua was captured at the same time, actually. So these 5 units, we stationed them.
Something is wrong.
Have a dependency capture. So that's some of our St. George, St. Mary's. We had representation.
Even if you're getting pain, it should be
And this is
intense.
very important. We wanted to
If it
ensure
was the muscle
greater
pain, it would just be
collect
there and then gradually.
across certain depths. So you'll see here. Particular distribution. So one is details 407 pretty response meaning it your gender. So I will trade you something not in the choose no gender. Majority of our were on the military fight. Now, the problem, slight problem, wasn't too worrisome, but there's the number of men being raiders went out. Those more forthcoming presented. We didn't recognize that. It's fairly tertiary education, 44%. And that we're able to look 8 years that we still have. I do appreciate that should be kind of structure, but I think if I was just saying, so still kind of parallels with that graph in population. Now, I want to say, because we will be indicating again. Segue into the key. So, if you remember, Professor Barbuda alluded that one of the objectives of this was to examine the perceived importance of a question of the case being important for the country. That was actually. Do you think the case is important to you? I want to hear from this. Now, 35% students noted that the case is important in the country. From there, carefully, an additional 34%, but even 35 indicated that they did not know or did not care. Now, what this tells us that 10% applicants could really, they really don't see it, or it doesn't matter to them, the king's importance or lack. So this level of, the lead Professor Margels alluded to this here. This the king in planes. This plane, one of your. Now we want to really drill down. So most Antiguans are king or it's not really important actually. Or they don't really care. Or they did that. But we wanted to break this down by education. If we had to look at the more good relative to the educated activity, what right? Data. You see here that those in the lower tiers of education of the primary secondary, higher percentage of that or interest. The subject of the role or perceived importance of the king for the country. What you're effectively saying here is that even though all education is not important, it's more pronounced lower tiers of educational attainment, you see it aversion to the king. Now, what was it? this contract. Technical education, they educated Antiguans. There was 30 to 46% noted that they was at least important in the country. Only more educated, which is we just because Professor Barges will tell you negative correlation between education and support. So what we did that we done at those findings were so there that we asked afterwards if you think is important reasons for your answer. So what we did, we took all the for among higher educated. Look at me. I was in more common 5, 6. Now, pay attention. These are more in a contingent country. So, among these were some of the responses. In that, the kings and the reasons. They want to facilitate cooperation, trade agreements, and cultural exchanges between these two countries. Tourism appeal can be lost as we shift away from the monarchy. I want you to understand this of your contingent. Such as affordable trade, tourism, or the estimation by products of retention of this monarchy system. It provides diplomatic, improved through between two countries. One that turned that quote unquote, and very difficult that is permitted with the monarchical system. They end up in a very difficult situation where they have these natural resources they can. So these coming up from personal opinions like this. And then finally, our network with other Commonwealth. So these were sentiments received of at least in the tertiary educated contingent. For food for thought, you know, Professor the need for education. Tell the story that even though you've been tertiary educated or you have education, it does not help. You might be educated in the political system of your country. Now, is look at Barbuda on the same question. Perceived importance of the king country and place them in their system countries. Think about Barbuda 30 countries. So if you have to rank, and we ask where does Antigua Barbuda sit? You can see 11 out of 40. So what I is noted is 11 out of 40 countries. The percentage of business who view the case role as at least someone. So 9%. Placing it in the lower tier region is in the region. Pay attention to the graph of the table here. Now, here, yes, is the highest, but here, no, when it comes to the perceived importance of the Antigua and Barbuda. Now, they choose Antigua and Barbuda to come here to this on this in fact. There's only evidence to get the analysis in the books. This is interesting. That the club of disinterest with these types of affairs. Antigua and Barbuda. Now, let's remember, one of the other objectives of the survey was to go beyond the British monarch and to see where sentiments are when it comes to the royal family. The other of the paramount. Should principally play a role and so remember the question we had before. His father, you can see where he fell. So we pointed it then to the likely successor. Now, it was no surprise that the relative majority fell in. Interestingly, 26.2% and 24.4% say no. So there was a difference comes to when it came to the Prince William's role or perceived importance for Antigua and its future. Now we also interviewed on the royal family. If they were aware, you'll notice something here. On the royal family, Prince Harry, only one remained as the most viewed. Perhaps he's the one that's most you see him in the media, you see him Meghan, and it's all in social media now. We're flooded with social media. So, but Prince Harry, positive sentiment. Now, so the Prince Andrew was the king himself, only 21 favorable, 25%. King Charles III actually invited this unfavorability, actual matching favorability. So there you have it. So Antigua's like much more than King III, his son, and his son. Now, another segment of the survey, I'm excited when I get to this part of the survey because this tested familiarity. And there were two questions we asked Antiguans. How familiar are you with constitutional? Of course, greater in which accessible to the average Antiguan. You have a place government sits as a representative at this time. So we asked that question. We did a follow-up question. We asked the head of state is connected now from the from the 18th century. Domicile here, considered to be part of the system. Now I want to look at these numbers. Remember, we asked them two separate questions: their familiarity with the monarchical system and the republican system. However, the percent are not all or slaves of the year. So let's look at 60% are not all or slightly familiar. But watch this contrast with the Republic. Over 70% not all or slightly familiar is or looks like. That tells you that the Republic with the Republican system than it is for the American. However, both systems still garner very low political literacy. So it's not about what might be happening in the educational system. Perhaps it also, well, I think it will have they very well have. So no is interested in a particular set of naturally it translates to the fact that you might not be one who's inclined to know. All right. So we go straight into one question that we asked, and we get straight to the heart of the matter. Would you support a system of republicanism for Antigua and Barbuda? Or are you satisfied with what you have in terms of the Constitution? Now, we wrote on that question better in terms of explaining what a Republican is. So, when we say support for Republican, we're saying having a president, not a governor general, a president as the head of state, disconnected from any monarchical system, in this case, the British monarch. So, as many would say, own head of state, relative to what we have here, where the governor general is pretty much just the representative. The true head of state is the king, just that the governor general stands as the representative of the same. Now, one of the results carefully. So when we pose this question now, about 1 in 4, 23%, almost 1 in 4, explicitly support the Republican option. 1 in 5, which is just under that percentage, supporting the current state of affairs. Constitutional monarchy here. 22.9%, which actually rival the same percentage of persons who support the Republic, indicating that they are uncertain. They're indifferent. 16.6% is they have no preference. Either system is fine to them. And 19.1% don't care. Now, if you add those, I hope you remember that trend that is telling to pay attention to. If you add 23% to 19%, you see that? 42%. 42% of Antiguans are middle ground. They either are uncertain or indifferent on this whole subject of support for Republican relative to support for one. Something to pay attention to. Now, remember that ranking system we did before on the perceived importance of the king for the country? So we established a new ranking system. We said, okay, let's see where Antigua and Barbuda sits now. Support for the republic and the support for monarchy. So if we split the two questions, support for republic, support for monarchy. So you can see here that this table here is split into two. So on the left, those you can't see, you have support for republic. Again, at the very lower tier of support resides Antigua and Barbuda, 23.1%. Now I want you to pay attention. Those countries that top support for republic, including Guyana, St. Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago. Those were the top. That we found among the countries highest level support. On the constitutional monarchy side, support for that system, Antigua is pretty much in the same ranking, over 40. So again, low. And I want you to pay attention to the top 3 countries. Montserrat, which is a dependent. Belize, another dependent. So 2 dependents. And Belize, and I know Professor Barajas will give you the context for anything that Belize is so high on this year. At the very bottom, something to pay attention to. Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, this is support for the monarchy, and Barbados, as you know, these are now the republic. These are coming part of the most recent interim system in terms of support for monarchy. And those, and one of the lists for public and will, these certificates of things. Yes. We're gonna.
At one stage, the countries that made the transition outside of Central, the countries that made the transition to republic, there is a stronger rejection of the monarchy. And that's obvious. What puzzles us, and we did more research, is why we have a pop republic in Italy, and the support for the woman is still high. And it's even more puzzling given the fact that that country transited to a republic without being a constitutional one. And the support for the woman is much higher than the other people. I would say that there are some things that we haven't been able to answer, then we need to tease them also. And I'm afraid of course
Yeah, interesting. Now, let's get into some more substance. Now, we asked the question, and this is a follow-up, obviously, to the question of whether Antigua support the Republic's transition or the current system. Antigua and Barbuda keep the king/governor general as head of state or have his own head or president. Findings are parallel to what we've seen in terms of the support question. 27% or 28% prefer a locally chosen head of state or president disconnected from the British monarchy. 81%, small percentage, prefer in general is interior. Now, I want you to pay attention to something here. A relative minority prefers a head. This is actually to remember the question we had, probably 23.1%. So there's support, 1 in 4 support for Republic, and just a bit more than 1 in 4, probably close to 1 in 3, almost there, for having an elected or selected head of state. That's obviously down here. Now, we wanted to go now and see how support for those, among those who have support for Republican transition, what the character from that perspective looks like. In terms of sex, age, education. Let's break down this sample. Let's see what kind of graphics we have. Now, support for Republic, so 1 in 5, or just close to 1 in 4, males and females, roughly equal. Notice, so there was no sex differences, or differences in sex when it came to both males and females were roughly equally supported. And this is also, interestingly, in contrast to the system that we currently have. Both males and females equally were supportive of what they have now, monarchical system. That was a bit higher, Republican transition. Now, this is what I want you to pay attention to. So we broke down the results by age, support for Republic by age. Now, one of the first things that I think struck us was the fact that younger people were the most undecided. And when we say younger people, between the ages of 18 to 24, if you look at the numbers, they're very low. Because a lot of that percentage was taken up in the responses of local. So if you follow this, 8% of young people support 18 to 24. Republic, that's 4.7%. So even though this is here, the percentages are below. So you're wondering, where did that go? They actually went to here. So we're seeing a lot of apathy towards the subject of Republican transition among our younger people. So we've got a Gen Z pop. And this is it's pretty problematic. I would say going into the younger millennials is about 25 to 30. Even though these numbers are much higher, 19.7%, these are still, I would say, concern things that we should take note of. Now, another key point that we found was that support for Republican peace in one of the middle-age categories, which is the 35 to 44. 35 to 64, but no break this to 35 to 44, 55 to 64. For these were the highest percentages that were apparent. Now, among the 65 plus, so there's almost a threshold. So when you break that 65 plus, support go from Republic back to minorities. So older people, those who are pushing largely the retirement, or well, beyond the retirement phase, they are the ones that we're seeing the support what you currently have today. Education, tertiary education respondents compared to technical education of secondary and primary. I want you to pay attention here. Now, we did make a point earlier that it was interesting to see that tertiary educated people were more inclined to be at least important relative to lesser educated, formally educated people in Antigua. But that was only a subject of the preceding part, because we showed you the key reasons. Those reasons were reasons that they believe were rooted in pragmatics. Like, for example, there's an economic value being connected. So that's where perhaps the education, formal education came in, even though many of those places are process of funding. But when it came to direct support and a logical standpoint here, so this was very well before the pragmatics. When it came to support for the public, you can see clear distinction that tertiary educated respondents were supportive of the Republican transition than they were for the monarchy. Yeah. So it shows a relatively higher, I don't think the comparison over 5% difference. So in many minorities, slight variation. If you look at primary, 22, 11%, there's still a higher support among primary level for the Republican, and the secondary level in the same case. At the technical vocational, you're pretty much tight in terms of this. So lower education groups feature a kind of a lower support overall, even though they have slightly more pro-Republican views. What are segments? So I think to or defer to Professor Barbuda to come in on this one. I'll come back. Yes.
Okay, so we want to ask, the respondents, how should the president, if we're going to establish a republic, sorry, a little people that agree that moving back and forth is sort of breaking, so good to see that we wanted to find out from them how they thought the head of state in a republic should be chosen. And what we see here is very strong support for participatory constitutionalism, as I described it a while ago. 47.2% of those that were surveyed indicated that the preference for was for directly elected head of state. They were asking for directly elected head of state. And that is pretty high, 232 individuals. In terms of those who felt that the head of state, as we do in some parts of the Caribbean, should be selected by the parliament, and that is election in Barbuda, right? Under the new, under the Republican Constitution. There are some thousands who are not in a constitution. We don't get them. There's a Republican Constitution. For me, there is, but for many people, there isn't any. So the president of Barbuda is actually selected at the end of the day by the members of the voters. And when we look at Antigua, what we see is less than 20% of those surveys felt that the head of state president should be selected by the parliament. What we noted is that there's an absolute rejection of the continuing discretionary power of a prime minister or the prime minister to determine, even after consultation with the leader of the opposition. So that is rejected, and the majority feels that citizens should make a decision as to who. That opens up a big kind of government, but that's not what we're here for. Otherwise, we'll never be here today. Right? We're talking about all of the consequences that flow directly from an directly elected head of state. So what we're seeing is clearly the people of Antigua and Barbuda clearly thinking about how persons should be more involved in decision making, and so they're looking for the appointment of an individual who would be more, perhaps more comfortable to the population than the present situation. Now, we asked further how they felt about the benefits that Antigua and Barbuda, and I'll come back to the history of the presidency, how Antigua and Barbuda had benefited from a British. And again, what is consistent is that people just don't care. They don't know, they don't care. So nearly 50% of those surveyed didn't know. 30% about wanted felt that the country had derived some benefits from the constitutional monarchy, and about a quarter of the population felt that real benefits. So what we're seeing there is we also saw that half of those surveyed didn't know whether the monarchy had benefited Antigua, and so there's a lot of uncertainty, even though we also see that there is support. And we have seen some of the reasons why the more educated felt that retaining a constitutional monarchy would actually be beneficial to Antigua. So again, to try to understand where some of the thinking came from, that's a further question. What are the advantages of maintaining the current monarchical constitutional monarchy? And we got a lot of responses. What we are is sharing you the most prominent or critical of those who receive this. We still continue to see people who say they don't know, they will learn, they never really thought about it. And so what we are saying is that clearly there's a very big understanding of the kind of system that we have. But definitely they emphasize the conduct links and what can be derived from being a member of the Commonwealth. They felt that having a constitutional monarchical system is a greater stability and continuity. They stressed the issue of tourism and prestige. I still don't understand that yet, but that is not from the people who sit in Antigua. They felt that the royal visits, Antigua, and many people who in the tourism sector can tell me whether there have been enhanced visits in Antigua around those royal visits to Antigua, but they felt that would be beneficial to the tourism sector. The historical branding is important. It will attract tourists presumably from and of course Britain, and there are those who emphasize the of royal connections. I don't understand what of royal connection is, but that is what we heard from Antigua. There are those who felt that maintaining a monarchical system provides us with an office which is a neutral arm of things political. And that is, of course, in the person of the religion, who many Antiguans felt was, in fact, and those who supported, was a non-partisan referendum in government that would be separated from local party politics, and therefore the office of the Governor General, in the way it was in fact selected, would lend itself to corruption in corruption. And of course, there are those who felt that continuing to have that system that we currently have would lead to a situation where, in the event that Antigua faced a crisis, That's not our, that is, we merely sharing that, you know, based on whatever evidence they have, would in fact step in during that crisis, whether the crisis be a political crisis, institutional one, an economic, financial, or natural disaster, like we are having in Antigua and Barbuda, not so long ago, the British government would in fact step in and provide the emergency support and assistance. They're looking for financial stability. If this would take place in relation to the current maintaining the current system. So we asked people that disadvantages of maintaining a monarchical system, and they say that maintaining ties us too much the idea of slavery. And that is a very painful reminder of colonialism, slavery, oppression, etc. In fact, many of them describe the whole situation as massive, and they talk about the historical subjugation. I should say that the context in which the survey was being done. I remember when the survey was being done, and when we started the survey in 2020, there was a lot of conversation about reparation, oppression. There was a lot of conversations about men for the region, etc. We can't avoid it, and we cannot avoid the analysis of that kind of in the region. And the recency of all of those things have been very critical, and I think when you look at the situation, you'll see that the response was even greater in relation to certainly the same as the case. We can't avoid the discussion of the establishment of, even if it is some years ago, of the current reparations commission with so Avery Beckles. We can't avoid it of the work of the local chapters of the reparations committee, which has led to some sensitization in some parts of the program. The fact that continuing the system that we have was very symbolic of the fact that we lacked full independence. Again, going back to the sentiments expressed earlier on, coming from G.K. Lewis, and of course, people felt that we need, there's no real, of course, there's a big debate as to whether that is in fact the case. So, that the king, killing the monarchical system, and the king today as the head of state, was symbolic, but it was really irrelevant. And they therefore see that maintaining the relationship really didn't have any real significance to the daily life of people. So we, of course, want to pose that as a question of the perception of what would be the advantages of making a transition into a republic. And so a lot of them did in fact say, ask this open-ended questions, that, when we transited to a republic, it would mean that finally we have become our own master. That we do not have a colonial master and all associated with the painful history of the Caribbean. So for those people, they felt that it would lead to a breaking of the colonial ties, it would lead to that full sovereignty, which independence had in fact not conferred Antigua and Barbuda. They felt that it became a republic, especially given the they felt that the president should be selected. It would in fact lead to a situation where the government of Antigua and Barbuda, and certainly maybe one of the executive branch of government, because now the republic have to, in practice, will continue a president that the government could be more accountable. Now, I'm not sure again where it is coming from. There are a lot of things that you have to really search for, because the question is what kind of a role that elected president would be performing, what kind of discretion would give to the elected president, and what would be the nature of the relationship between that elected president and the president. I mean, this is muddy, and but we didn't get into that. These are things to be answered. I don't think that a lot of people have given much thought to that. I see Zabe smiling because I know that one of the people and like, I would be a former student. was in fact a French political system. I remember using that word. And the French political system is not an easy system. It's a very difficult, complex system, which you have to powerful as a state. And I'm not sure if the elected president in the Caribbean might potentially lead to such a situation. But it didn't tell us exactly what was the nature of the system. And of course, they spoke about modernizing our system and the fact that becoming a republic with a self-reliance. Again, it's just assumptions. I don't know what based on in terms of disadvantages, well, they said that we are not ready financially, we are not ready institutionally, we're not ready psychologically or mentally for that transition, that there are too many costs associated with making that transition and changing things. This is something you just have to deal with. You have to change your letterhead, you have to change your thing. These are costs which are associated with a transition anyway. That will lead to greater political instability, so I don't know if they make it. Honestly, but that we find across the Caribbean, I think sometimes we become jaded by perhaps based on in the 1970s when we did that transition, but it's not really necessarily related to transition to republic, but more related to politics of the ground in Ghana, which is very much connected to the ethnic base and organization which you find in that country. But and the same thing, and I say that because when you look at the Barbuda exercise. And going back before 2020, all the constitutional reform commissions, certainly the ones that took place after the transition, that took place the Fox Commission in the 1970s in Barbados, they had a similar thing that Barbados should not transition to a republic because look at what happened in Guyana, because look at what happened in Trinidad. And they forget that we live in a period of economic turbulence globally, and that we have been responsible for the associated that with the transition from constitutional to and maybe if we have done some just disaggregating the data further, you may have found that many of the people who felt so are in fact the old population who were very much aware of this in the 1970s. But I can't tell you that was the case because we didn't disaggregate the data for this presentation. That will make a competition, but we didn't read this. There are those who felt that if we remove the king or the crown from an existing political order, it would lead to the loss of many benefits that we apparently from being constitutional. The fear that we would lose our formal connections. Again, I spoke a while ago about education and awareness and knowledge, so they felt that we would lose that. I think as was taken, and I don't think that has was taken. I don't think I certainly don't think we are members of the common. But we need to be able to explain that to people, and we have failed to do that. That is part and parcel of the problem. So if you are serious about making the transition, I'm not saying that you have to get serious about doing it, but if you are really serious about it, there's work that we need to do. We talk about, in spite of it, we talk about the loss of UK visa advantage, diplomatic support, the appeal that they spoke about a while ago, and of course, never persistent fear, significant fear, that there are corruption risks in sharing ties with the British in terms of the constitution. So I want to go to an area that I think is important for us. It did not fall necessarily into the but I think it's important. Because if you're going to engage with our constitution, if you're going to move to a republic, it means certain things. And therefore, one of the questions that was asked of Antigua, and remember, I spoke a while ago about the participatory constitutionalism. So one of the, and a referendum is most decided on the better, I think, examples of participatory constitutionalism at work. So we asked Antigua, if you're going to make, and therefore alter the existing basic structure of the Barbuda, and should be a referendum. And as you can see, yes, all the population felt that there should be a referendum. Nearly half, not quite half, but nearly half of the And I want you to remember that. Bellingham felt that there should be a referendum. You get something like what? 45% of the population again, which is very angry. Just don't give a damn. You don't care as to whether it is a referendum or not. And 6% felt that Antigua should go for a republic without that is really insignificant. 6%. As for the type of president, even if the president is elected by the people under this new republic, presumably, well, let's not say presumably here, as there are very toss up between whether or not there should be a ceremonial president. That's more or less the same thing which the government general is doing, or there should be an executive president, which raises the question as to whether we will still need to be prime minister. Or not, and of course, again, the single largest category is the don't care. I don't care what you ask those questions. These questions are not very important. So what we see is that in terms of method of selection, 47.2% felt that, again, we came to what we discussed about, felt that the president should be directly elected by the people, 15% elected by parliament, and under 10% by the people. I think it's important to talk about the issue of a referendum. And so what we need to do is look at, and we can talk about the global picture. The global picture in relation to a referendum, when it comes to changing the basic structure of our constitution, that most countries mandate and have a referendum. And that is the case in practically all of Commonwealth Caribbean. One noted example, which is why Barbuda is able to make that transition very, very easily. So, this, when we look at constitutions in the Caribbean, what we'll see is that the constitutions in the Caribbean, in relation to changing the structure of our constitution, demands a referendum. And that is when we talk about the supreme order. You need to have a referendum, and also when it comes to changing the political system in itself. So if you want to go from a constitutional monarchy to a republic, that is changing the basic structure of the constitution, and we need a change. When we look at our constitution, practically all of us say what we see. If you look specifically at the Constitution of Barbuda, you have to go to Section 47 of the Constitution, which shows that it is different and it is changing from a constitutional monarchy to a republic is not an easy route. The constitutional provision presents what Richard Albert, a renowned global constitutional scholar, says imposes handcuffs on the people. There's very little that we can do. Our constitution sort of what we currently have, and it's very difficult. So even when we think it's the best thing to do, we can't change it. The constitution imposes certain limitations in relation to an expectation in relation to. So you need 2/3 of all the members in both houses to agree to amend the constitution in the first instance. And Antigua and Barbuda asked us in context divided. Probably not as deeply divided as Guyana. In the context of partisan politics, whether or not we will get that kind of thing. You may get it, perhaps that is why the Prime Minister said, in the next 3 years, we will have this referendum. Time, he had a two-thirds majority, or yet two. In a context of no, and you can go to places like St. Vincent prior to this election. It's very difficult. And we saw what happened when in 2009 they attempted to change the structure in St. Vincent and having this referendum. Total failure, we saw it in Grenada, total failure. Referendums have a very unhappy history in the Caribbean. They have failed except for one, two. One happened with Belize, for Barbuda, and the other had to do with referendum on the Fox government when they wanted to change the constitution. Everybody knows it. So our history of referendum is this. It's just been this. So, but these are the things we have to do. And of course, these are just the first hurdle. The second hurdle you have is the major hurdle is referendum. Because when Parliament makes decisions, we didn't have to take the part. That is why you can't do what you can. Unless Antigua wakes up and you have an emperor or king, and not a constitutional monarchy, but a monarchy. There's a distinction between a constitutional monarchy and a monarchy. Unless you get a political by fear, I don't know how this is going to happen or what happened. You have to have a referendum, and again, even at the referendum, you need to still majority. And you have to ask yourself, again, we are very partisan. To what extent? What is suggested? You need support from both government and opposition, but you get people on board to support the idea of the making the change. Otherwise, it will just crumble. And I extracted from that one. So this is a sort of three-phase approach. You have to introduce the bill, and it has to be supported by, as I said, the two-thirds majority. And so, the amendment, which is outlined on the section 4 of the Constitution, says that you need a specified parliamentary voting majority in both houses, which is pretty high. It's 50 plus 1% is pretty high. So, in fact, what you're getting is, in a sense, an institution of majority. And then you have opportunities for the public to participate via that mandatory referendum. And there is also what Robinson and others have described as a time delay, what they call the pure reflection, 90 days after it has been before you can actually take it to the people. 90 days reflection. So all of those three things are really critical. For you to get that change to the constitution. To what extent do you the parties that you see on the ground and to the computer to get all these things to the can? So that although we all may agree at the end of the day that everything, taking everything into consideration, perhaps the best thing for taking a computer to become. Would you get that to full majority? The opposition, even though they tell you privately in some of those countries that they believe in republicanism, they do not want to go the Republican route. And presumably, when you flip and the pendulum changes, then the government who has been kicked out and is now the opposition can begin support us when we took that decision, and therefore we're not going to do. Even if they believe that is politically correct, the right to determination, politics, partisan politics, will in fact get in the way. So I will allow my colleague to final summary.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Martel. I'm going to just allow you to reflect on five key points, that summarize this work. And I want you to be able to reflect 5 summary points. Hopefully they can inform questions that will come at the end. But I want to be here this evening. So, Antigua Parliament, one of the first things to take note of. The monarchy's relevance is really low. 35%, remember, 1 in 3 Antiguans say that the king is not important. And this is combined with don't know and don't care. So that's at least 70% are detached or unsure about this British monarch's importance in the country. The second key summary point is that over 60 to 70% of Antiguans are not familiar with the constitutional monarchy or the republican system. And more so the republican system. That percentage is actually, as you know, higher. Over 70% of Antiguans who are unfamiliar. Over 60% who are unfamiliar with what exists currently. The third summary point is that there is that soft lean towards reform. We know we saw some polarization across different categories of Antiguans. It's noteworthy that 20 to 25%, if you see here, is explicit support for that transition. Summary point 4. Republic, they have a number of advantages that were offered up to us of moving to a republic. And you can see here, among the more notable advantages cited, independence, pride, breaking colonial ties, stronger local representation. Some of the buzz themes emerge from the advantages that were given to us. But these were matched against the perceived cons of the transition. Fear of not being ready, possible corruption, loss of benefits is too costly. And the final summary point, and I think this really sums up the context for Antigua, recognizing that there's that high uncertainty, or lack of knowledge rather, surrounding this whole subject of constitutional monarchy versus republicanism. We asked one last question in the survey, and that question was, how do you think government can support this, the educational needs? And a range of responses emerged from Antiguans when it comes to transition to republic. And it was clear from our standpoint that it needs to be a comprehensive nationwide public education campaign. And not just a campaign that is a general one, but targeted at the schools, targeted at the communities, targeted at the workplaces, across tiers of society on, this considerably political benefits and advantages. And I think Professor Barjas said it well. It needs to be this weakened civic understanding of our civics or political history. I think that has to be revived. And this is not peculiar to Antigua. As if you follow us, and we'll close here, if you follow us, you'll realize that there are other presentations that we're doing, and don't be surprised that some of these results will pretty much themselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Our presentation on republicanism and constitution. Thank you.
So I think we can open it up to questions. There's a microphone here. Don't all rush.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions. The first one is going into the details of the actual study. I wondered, I don't know the answer, but I wondered if there were any specific questions that were asked in relation to symbolism, especially symbols referring to the monarchy or I guess, well, referring to the monarchy. I asked in relation to Antigua being part of the Cohesius economic union, for example. I know there was a lot of conversations when Barbuda made the transition to a republic. There were questions about whether we can do the same, but I guess the most, in my spheres, the most support that I saw was a change for our money, as opposed to a change for our political system. So I wondered if there was any connection in your survey. And then the second question is in relation to the process. I guess it's a comment also on that question. I know that within the Constitution, there's a minimum time limit as to when the referendum can happen, but the public part of the public referendum can happen after the two-thirds votes occur. maximum. And I say that because I assume my suggestion from experiencing the last one, my suggestion would be that I think a public campaign cannot be held in the context of an election cycle. And 90 days is very, very similar to the 30-day period where Parliament ruled. And, you know, the two parties went in their camps and then they divided up support. If the referendum period was longer, maybe a year and a half, and rather than this excitement and buzz about let's win this vote, it's more of a conversation and a discussion about what are we deciding on first, and then what will the decision be? Maybe that would be more successful.
I'll answer the first question. Professor Marchels will address the second one. So to the question on whether the survey captured information on symbols, no, that was the material objective of the survey. But I can tell you that from the Barbadian perspective, we actually, a committee was set up, I was part of that committee, to review a lot of the symbols, the flag, arms, the anthem, the pledge. We actually did a major town hall, some important insights. I can tell you that Barbadians are quite fine with symbols that they have. Coat of arms have, I would say, perhaps the most attention when it came to possible changes. But as for those who are familiar, the coat of arms is actually a gift from the British to Barbadians. But that would be one of the items or emblems that we had. Was pretty much self-developed. So it was understandable that it was a call for a slight adjustment to the coat of arms. But the flag, the pledge, the anthem, pretty satisfactory. So perhaps if you do a follow-up, looking at how the different symbols of the Antigua people, how they react, we could very well find comparable stuff. I do know Trinidad and changing some local events that thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. I'm not sure if I entirely understood your question, because the Constitution does not make any provision for exactly when a referendum should take place. What it says is that it wasn't a referendum. In terms of the time delay I spoke about, it was specifically if you can focus on Section 47 of the Constitution. 47.5, one says there has been an interval of no less than 90 days between the introduction of the bill in the House and the beginning of proceedings in the House on the second reading of the bill in the House. But it doesn't speak of a timeline for the referendum. It can in fact take, this is when I look at it. Others do, but this one goes in. So it can take place anytime. You can have it pass in the House, and you can probably take 5 years, 3 years, or 3 years, or whatever the case is. Right? I think a lot may be contingent or based on whether or not, even having been successfully packaged in the House in the first, second, or what happened readings in the House, whether or not there is a view or perception that the population is likely to support. Because the truth of the matter is that, as we know, very, very no prime minister is going to hold a referendum that he or she believes is going to lose unless that is his purpose. Right? And no prime minister is going to introduce, unless it's forced to by circumstances, to introduce something like that in the parliament if he is not in fact desirous of seeing his success. So, to answer your question, there's nothing in the Constitution that says what should be the time other than there must be a referendum. And I understand your concerns about during an election. I don't think anybody should have a referendum around the time when the life of parliament comes to. It becomes important of the partisan politics on the ground that you want a referendum of this nature to rise.
Good evening. Firstly, let me congratulate both professors on what is, I think, very interesting research, and the findings are certainly, I think, educational. but they're not surprising, at least not to me. And I say that because I think much of the Republican, and the chairperson perspective in the ask question, much of the Republicanism debate, in my opinion, has been the niche obsession of a very particular demographic of society that is obsessed with decolonization and based on politics and whatnot. But I think the reason why it's apathy in the context of Antigua is because for all of the talk of decolonization and symbolism and removing the white man's head and whatever, there has not been a real explanation that links that what are socioeconomic issues affecting people and their daily struggles in the context of a developing country. And apathy, people say I don't know, I don't care, is perhaps because on the low economic end, you don't see the translation as to how does this republicanism improve my daily living conditions, socioeconomic effects, how does it improve my life? I think on the end, when you see educated people talk about their apathy or they don't care, is because there is a, perhaps, and this is reflected I think in one of your findings, there is a distrust of domestic institutions. And there is a distrust of domestic institutions because we've seen the result of politics. There's even a movement now to say we should go back to dependencies because it's such a disillusionment to the political class and their perceived failure, perceived or actually to deliver the gains of independence. But even among the educated bracket, there is this sense that we know ourselves and we need this sort of guiding hand from the European, from our former colonial masters to sort of step in when we have a crisis or so or that. So one of the things that I've asked or been interested to know is how does this, class as well as education. I think education sort of proxy for us, right? But so how does someone at the income level view this as well as an educational level? Because I think that is what is happening. The second thing I also want to ask is whether or not there was any attempt to really devolve this question of what the republic. Because it's a very interesting result where we talked about different a ceremony as an executive president. And I really think that was explored further. You would see maybe findings where the people in favor of having an executive style president. That is to say, a president with prime minister launch the ceremony. And I think that people, particularly those that are well educated, see the context of what has happened in the states that have transitioned, particularly to an executive style presidents in countries, and they are afraid because they think the same thing will happen in the context when they see virtual dictatorship, the role of a president and students in that. So how does that then translate into people's views of the two styles of republicanism? But overall, the presentation and thank you very much for research.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm supposed to answer those questions. I think for the most part, I would say that I conclude some of the views you expressed. Some I don't agree. In terms of the survey itself, did not expressly address the issue of people's income levels and other social and another economic issues. Maybe that is something we should have done, but try to keep the questionnaire as short as possible. And in relation to whether or not we should have, I guess, teased out some more from the Antiguans on the question of what type of purpose here, and it would require that from us that we engage in some level of education, again, which is not what we want to do. We simply want it at this point in time, especially when we understand that in many parts of the Caribbean where they are engaged in constitutional reform, we don't get that level of I think, public awareness program that Professor Devin spoke about So we didn't want to, in fact, raise issues that will, in a sense, outcome of the survey that we were in fact. That is not us. That is where it is at right now in Antigua, and for the policymakers, etc., people who are in civil society groups to respond to what they on the ground. I can't remember the first question.
Only three conclusions, because no matter the system of government in the Caribbean, we tend to see all of it as Babylon system and all of it as corruption. But especially when you look on the younger persons who majority of our news and understanding of any sort of government comes from social. So automatically you don't care because we just see it as the same system, we're going to get the same wine, just same, different bottle. So we don't see the need for it. And then this view I have is that when you look at the older bit of persons who really have time for the monarchy, you find that maybe because they were there when we went to the whole independence bit of things, so they would have seen what society was like before independence and recognizing that with independence, not a whole much have changed. So they say, we don't really like Sylvan Ryan said, we don't really do well with it, so might as well stay.
I don't know, again, I don't know the question, but I think your question sort of resonates with what I forgot initially what you were asking. But you were speaking of the issue, I think, of trust. And what we are seeing in the Caribbean, all across the Caribbean, is that there are lower levels of trust for a variety of reasons. So whether the level of corruption that we've seen all across, from Bahamas in the north, like the Bahamas, and we all the way to Canada, and that in a sense has really negatively impacted the perception of Caribbean people of the government. I mean, corruption is not something that is unique to the Caribbean, but we have to deal with the Caribbean issue, and that is an important factor for sure in relation to people's perceptions to whether or not it should change now something else. But somebody has to show people instance. Again, in relation to the issue of trust and corruption, this is number one indication as to whether or not the republics that we have in the Caribbean are in fact more corrupt than the constitutional monarchies. And there is no evidence. In fact, some time ago, the late Selwyn Ryan from Trinidad and Tobago had an article in the newspaper that I used, some of my students were here. Remember, it said, most corrupt of us all. And it's really unknown which one is real. And I said, well, Trinidad and Tobago used to be known as the king of Barbuda. And it seems a bad response to Antigua. They don't judge me. Just tell them what was in the newspaper. But when you look at the corruption perception index, what we're seeing is that Caribbean is so high in terms of level of corruption. Barbados is probably the best performing in relation to that. I always say that I don't have certain results, so the perception index is a perception. It depends always on who in fact you are questioning. And the reality is that we don't have citizens. What are the perceptions of corruption? In government, what we do is to ask some things. So we bring together business people, we bring together some academics, and we ask them a question about the perception about the ease of doing business in the country. And they say, well, it's not so difficult in Barbados, and therefore they run Barbados perhaps better than they run some of the Caribbean countries. When visibly in your eyes and in an argument wrong, you know that there are greater levels of corruption in some countries. I'm not saying Barbados, but there are greater levels of corruption in some countries. That's point where on that thing. But the important point here is that you are raising the initiative when he spoke was the fact that there are low levels of trust in government, and that low level of trust, whatever the source of that, is partly responsible for the lack of support for any traction or any movement from what we have currently to something else. And secondly, it is unfortunate that sometimes those of us who are more aware, and perhaps some educated, but perhaps some people who are not so educated, because we make a mistake in the Caribbean way to read this. I say that all the time. We believe people who are more educated and more aware. When you go by the option, when you meet a lot of people who are not so educated, and they all know a lot more about what is taking place in the Caribbean. Some people certainly are the place of the Western experiences elsewhere, who are the beneficiaries of the education. They just simply are more concerned.
Thanks for the presentation. It was quite interesting. It is, for me, particularly concerning, just as you pointed out, the level of disinterest it seems by, for example, the group who want to be more educated. And I suspect part of that, for that particular category of respondents, may be that some of them may not be familiar with forces in relation to how governments function. And that is something I've observed in some of, in that bracket. But then overall, there is indeed a gap in terms of people understanding just basic things about government in the country and governance. And I'm strongly of the position that civil action, more action, education, may move the dialogue further in people understanding both about how governments should work, what we have now, and also know what we have now versus what we can have. And I hope that in some you understand that this is it's a journey. It's not going to happen in any short. Just to state in relation to the comment a while ago brought this in there. Yeah, I know from an exercise I was involved in, that people think we have a very corrupt country. So it's terrible. And oh yeah, lastly, for educated people to devote political activities of one kind or another, that is a reflection to of their willingness to be part of any process to change. And those things require some degree of time and convincing people that it's part of civic responsibility. Thanks again.
Good night. Again, thank you for your presentation. I often wonder, when I look around, why on Independence Day everybody says happy independence. What does that mean to persons? I look around like because many persons travel out of Antigua to have their children. Many persons, they try to give up their monstrous get a British passport. And I keep wondering, I would really happy to be independent. From that, many of these children who are in the don't care. Many of these children are born overseas. And to me, the civic takes a while to and we do not, I don't think we have that kind of class in school. Try to understand types of government in a real way. And they are educated by social media like their plans, many of them, their plans to me, they're looking forward to the day when they leave the country. So when you ask them, when they want something on the other day, not that they don't care about this system, they want to belong to someone. That's how I see it. Because seeing everybody else wants the country. And that's just my comment. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I would say that in our survey, all of our sample participants were domiciled here in Antigua and Barbuda. But I do agree with your point that the hurdles convenient by for the attention of our young people, especially the 18 to 24 category. So I wasn't surprised to see that level of apathy. I referred to it in a previous presentation I did on a different subject as this contagion of apathy. For example, when you have your apathy in one area, it's likely that apathy can spread. So something that we really have to take note of.
If we take one more, our final question.
Amen. Interesting presentation. Samuel, to be here again. Now, within the Commonwealth Caribbean, republicanism was often reframed as a constitutional and symbolic advancement of sovereignty, identity, and post-colonial self-definition. And so I see this as a move in terms of full independence and freedom. We are talking about freedom in which we seek to pursue it. And so my philosophical disposition is that it is a preferred position. But my interest lies mainly in how do we educate more people? Yes, in terms of the school and so on, but an effective way of educating all people. Because when we mirror the examples of Guyana, Dominica, and maybe Barbados, well, of course, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, in terms of an effective strategy of educating our people, and that's where my content is at.
Thank you, Sandra. Good to see you in person. So the question about how do we start crafting this education strategy? Now, one of the things that I came across, this is something that we probably went over in the paper, but it was a study that spoke about two general ways in which you can educate farmers. And it begins one with a general awareness campaign. We need to ensure that the different media platforms, if you think about it, we have social media, we have those media platforms are offline, the traditional media, as we call it, TV and radio. We need to get the messaging there. And it's not just the nature of the messaging, it's how we message. It's very important. Now, the second tier of education, this is all happening concurrently, is the targeted one. This is where we go to schools. We incorporate this in our curriculum I'm talking from primary right up to tertiary. Target this in the communities. We revive those community educational programs that we had back in the 80s and 70s. We need to get into community because a lot of the young people are not coming to us. They might not come to the doors by violence, so we have to go to them. I remember during COVID, and I was always saying this, during COVID, there was some talk about how to get this vaccine, deal with this vaccine hesitancy, how do we deal with the COVID-19 conspiracy theories. You know, the government was saying we're going to put it on the government and information pages. And I remember saying, we have to keep them where they are. You have to be right there. So the government decentralized, they had mobile units of vaccination in the communities. When they were educated, they went into the communities. And I think we have to revive that particular strategy. So yes, a general campaign, but we also have to have a targeted educational initiative at different spaces, from social right down to tradition. Thank you.
Let me just share something with you on that question that you raised. And I'm taking from my experience with the Central Constitution Conference, which lasted for about 5 years. I'm trying to make people discuss with people what are their thoughts on wider constitutional reform. And we held many town hall meetings, many. Often, if the entire or almost all of the commission met with the people in the town halls, and with a big commission, 25 people, but maybe we have about 16 people who were always there. Sometimes we had more commissioners than we had people attending the town hall. If people are not interested in coming to this, again, because it's not the concerns that you raise, when people are more concerned about health issues and social issues, etc., so maybe the directly relate with constitutional reform. They are not going to do that. So what we did is that we went where the people were. We didn't have a town hall meeting. So we actually know, I recall going to the, I think is one of the development actions. Because the workers wanted to hear about constitution, but they couldn't come out or they did not want to. And therefore, what we did, we took 2 or 3 hours of our time, we went to the bank, set of workers, they asked each answer, and we gave whatever information we had. And I found that to be very practical in relation to actually getting necessary information. So it must be a mixed approach. You can't just say, okay, we want to have a media blitz. A lot of us, people tell me all the time, you didn't business people are perfect. They don't read a newspaper. They don't read a newspaper. It's not just our children who read newspapers. Big business captains of industries don't read newspapers, so you can't do that. Some of us do listen to, I find the talk show, as much as sometimes we don't like some of the talk show programs on radio and they're very effective. They reach the people, people listen to them. So again, that is some of the things the Constitutional Reform Commission did in St. We went on talk shows, we spoke to the people, we got comments, and went into the secondary schools, that was it. And admittedly at the time we would not be participating in the referendum, but the idea was that the referendum would take place sometime in the future, not immediately. So we went there. So you have to meet people. You can't just always have a formal discussion. Get people interested in sometimes what I sometimes describe as some dry areas that will not really work the kind of interest that will work with food. Some people tell me sometimes the things that may interest you about which is a dry area. Most people are not interested in it. In St. Lucia, what we also came up with jingles. And the jingles literally work to get people to talk and call the radio station to comment on the process of constitution. Thank you.
Just want to give you small tokens on behalf of our campus. People don't forget.
You know I love this.
Yes, again, I want to thank our 2 colleagues. I think they deserve another round. I want to thank you for being apathetic. It's coming out to a public lecture on a Friday evening, December. It shows your interest, and we want to thank you for coming out. You should give yourselves a round of applause. I want to continue to support our campus as we seek to ramp up this aspect of the campus. I think we've had, since I've been here 2.5 years, we've had tremendous success in ramping up student enrollment, more than double since I've been here. This aspect is as important as the degree granting aspect, where we want to lift the quality of public debate in Antigua and Barbuda, and these public lectures are an integral part of that. So I want to thank you for coming out and continue to support us and bring your family and friends. I want to thank our marketing officer, especially Mr. Maloney, for coming out on his vacation. Together. Coming out and setting us up. So again, thank you everyone. Travel safely and move on. Thank you.